Hello and welcome to the Rusted Brush. Today we gather in the shadowy depths to explore the new FleshEaterCourts models, where madness reigns supreme and horror knows no bounds. I'll show you the assembly, what I think of the models, and how I painted them in my GrimDark style. Let's begin with the assembly. These models I got are from the army box they were selling a while ago. My intention is to use them for Warhammer Fantasy, specifically the Old World, so they're going to be on square bases. Starting with the GrimDark, these models were stupid easy to assemble. Like most new Games Workshop kits, just follow the instructions for the most part, and there isn't any extra work to do. To add to the look I'm going for, I used some armor and shield bits from the GW Skeletons and Graveguard kits. I used some of the Flesh Eater heads that had helmets on them, Frostgrave Cultist hoods, some 3D printed parts I had lying around, and some visors from the Perry Miniatures Agincourt Knights. I used some green stuff to help fill in some of the gaps on the neck area for the heads to fit on the bodies and look more natural. I also added some bulbous lumps with some of the green stuff I had left over. I have to say, I really enjoyed putting these guys together. I prefer these over the normal ghouls that GW sells. The poses are much less uniform, and they feel a lot more intimidating since they wield actual weapons instead of bones and claws. I never really liked the ghouls too much. I used them more for bits more than anything. These new GrimDark are just fantastic, and I'll definitely be picking up more. As for the Gore Warden, which I'm going to be using as a Ghoul King with wings, it's a pretty decent model. I don't like the keys in one hand, so I replaced it with a sword, and I like the look a lot more. I like the idea that he uses his claws in one hand and his sword in the other. It gives him some character, and it would feel odd that he wouldn't use a real weapon. I also drilled out the eyes for some real macabre vibes. Moving on to the Vargulf, this was one of the main reasons I picked up this army box. I love this model. It's a lot less bat-like than the older rendition, and more of an unholy beast. It's so sinister and it has some uncanny feeling to it, like that maybe it's got some human qualities that you're not so sure of. I decided I wanted to make it even creepier looking. I ripped its jaw on one side and added some green stuff to the face to simulate flayed skin. I also drilled out the eyes, and the last little disturbing thing I did was sculpt an eye on its back. Now let's move on to painting. For the most part, I'm going to be showing you the footage of the GrimDark since I painted the Vargulf and the Ghoul Warden in the same way, but I'm going to be showing you some clips of those guys as well. So to start, I used Vallejo White Spray Primer to all the models. I decided not to do a zenithal highlight like I normally do since I'm going to be darkening and shading the models a fair bit. Which brings us on to the first shade immediately. I use AK Deep Shade Pure Grime to darken the model and to also help me see what details pop out. Paint the skin with Army Painter Warrior Skin Speed Paint. This is going to be an undercoat for the skin to have a bit more of a fleshy colored tint underneath. I then paint over the skin with Vallejo Model Color Ivory. This is going to give it a sickly pale look that I want. On the wings of the Ghoul Warden, I leave the membrane the way it looks so it's a good fleshy contrast with the rest of the skin. I use hardened leather or ruddy fur speed paints on the fur and on any other wooden bits. I switch between the two so that the models aren't exactly the same in colors. For the metal bits, I use broadsword silver speed paints. I wanted to use something simple because I'm going to be darkening and weathering these a lot. For any bones, I use pallid bone speed paint. Like the metal, I keep it pretty simple for the same reasons, and also they're very minor details on most of the models. Going back to the skin, I decided to add another layer of ivory paint to the skin to make it a bit more pale. The paint was fairly thin, and I thought the original skin color was popping out a bit too much. Next I paint some of the shields, armor, and helmets with Vallejo White. The reason I chose white is because it really makes the rust and grime pop out more. It makes a good contrast against those colors. It was a fairly common practice in the medieval period to paint poorly kept armor so that it hid imperfections. Now it was time for the banner. For this, I used my signature use of stamps. I look at the options I like and compare them to the space I had to place them on the flag. I like the look of this stamp with monks on them. It's like a hint to their previous life before their descent into undead creatures. I cut it into shape and glue it on. I use watered down PVA glue for this. I'll be making a separate video on why and how I use stamps. With that, we go to covering the whole model in AK Engine Grime enamel paint. This will really weather, darken, and shade the models. Once it's dry, I use white spirits and Q-tips to wipe off the enamel paints, leaving it in the most recessed areas. I decided that I wanted to dirty up the models a bit more, so I added AK Muddy Ground to their bases, weapons, armor, and some lower areas of the body. This will look great when I add the rust effects next. Speaking of which, I used the Dirty Down rust paint on the metal areas, and this isn't the easiest product to use out of the box. Remember to shake and mix it well. I recommend using warm water to help control where you want the rust to be as well. There are other videos on how to use this. I live in a colder environment, which makes this paint a bit trickier to use than normally. Now I add my own recipe for older blood and gore. This recipe I discovered by accident. I use blood for the blood god and mix it with engine grime enamel paints from AK. Trying to mix the paints takes a bit of effort, but once you apply it to the desired areas, the effect is great. I recommend trying this if you want something different from normal blood effects you see being used. The next thing I do is paint some of the darker areas with thinned down Drakenhof Nightshade. I also use this paint to make veins on the skin and eyes of the Vargolf. Just make sure your brush has a good point for this, as you don't want these too large as it will tint the skin to a bluish hue. Moving on to the eye, I paint a circle for the start of the iris. It looks a little bit small, so I enlarge it just slightly. I contemplated leaving it like this, but I decided to paint the iris red. I made a slightly smaller circle, leaving a black border around it. I used wine red to start and highlighted it with vermilion red. Both of these are AK 3rd Gen paints. After, I paint a small black dot in the middle. The last step for the eye was to apply AK wet effects over the whole surface of it, to give it a more glossy and immersive vibe to it. I also did small versions of these eyes on certain lumps of the ghouls. One step I did while I was contemplating on the color of the eyes was to add more gore. For this, I used Yoo-Hoo glue and blood for the blood god, and added it to the wounded jaw, claws, and some other areas of the Vargolf to give it more of a savage appearance. To finish the models, I added a mix of static grass, leaves, and tufts to match the autumn vibe of my undead. And with that, the models are done. Here's some better looks at the models. So I wanted to conclude this video with my inspirations and my final thoughts on the new models. To start with, here I compare the old ghoul with the new crypt guard. Paint job aside, I feel the older poses are a little goofy. The hand reaching out looks like it's waving to greet you. It feels a lot less human too, and more primal, which I personally don't like as much. The whole line is fantastic, and these models are perfect for so many different games. Frostgrave, Mordheim, Turnip 28, and Last War are just a few I can think off the top of my head. Anyone into GrimDark kit bashing will love these models. They'll make a good frame for any lesser being. If you mix bits with the Cawdor gang with them, you could make some excellent looking 40k peasants. As for inspirations, when I first saw these models, I thought they would be perfect choice for making a creepy undead army. For me, I like to have my undead to look grim and scary. I see so many paint jobs like the one I showed you with the weird green colors, or they're just a little too classic Halloween looking if you know what I mean. For inspirations, the main one was Berserk. Nothing in specific, but the overall vibes and creatures. And by extension, the Thrall from Dark Souls 3 was a pretty obvious piece of inspiration as well. And with that, this concludes the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. Take care, everyone.